Good morning and welcome back to the final hearing in docket 2015-06, the Energy Facility Siting Board. Before we have all of the parties introduce themselves, are there administrative matters, Council?
Yes, just a couple. Since our last hearing, there have been a number of exhibits that have been filed. I'll list them. I don't believe the parties have any objection to them, and if that's the case, they can all be admitted as well. There's Inventergy 37C, which is the supplemental testimony of Ryan Hardy. Inventergy 142I, which is a supplemental exhibit to CLF 10-7 and Town 41-1. There's Town 36, which is the supplemental testimony of Glenn Walker. Town 37, which is the town's response to record request 10. And CLF 14, which is the supplemental testimony of Robert V.
And are there any objections?
No objections here.
No objections.
No objection from CLF.
No objections.
No objection from Inventergy.
Very well, then they can all be admitted to vote. Anything further, Council?
Chairperson, could I make a brief statement?
Before we identify all the parties?
No, let's do that first.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Good morning on behalf of Inventergy. Elizabeth Noonan with me is Mike Blazer from Inventergy, as well as behind me Nicole Verdi, Richard Beretta, and Allan Shore of the College in Shannon.
Good morning, Mike McElroy for the Town of Borough.
Jerry Elmer, Conservation Law Foundation, and with me at council table today is Dr. Timmons Roberts.
Andrew Marcaccio on behalf of the Office of Energy Resources. Here with me today is Nicholas Ucci, Deputy Commissioner, and also Dr. Alan Cool.
Jennifer Sternick on behalf of Statewide Planning.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. McElroy?
Thank you, Chairperson. I'd like to just take a moment to express my deep appreciation and thanks for the cooperation of everyone in this room during my recent health challenges. This board has been extremely accommodating, and special thanks go to Board Counsel Patty Lucarelli, who's been terrific in accommodating my needs in this matter. And all council sitting here, and again, special thanks go to Michael Blazer, who's been nothing but gracious throughout this. This is a hotly contested matter, but when it came to this particular problem, the challenges placed on the lawyers in this matter took a back seat, and I want to thank all the lawyers, all the board, all the witnesses who I know were inconvenienced by the changes in the schedule. I'm sorry I had to ask for that, but not one person indicated that they had any problem with accommodating it, and I want to thank everyone publicly. So thank you, Rick.
And thank you, Mr. McElroy. Okay, and now, I believe we're starting with Inventergy's witness.
Yeah, I think so. Mr. Hardy, come back up to the witness stand for us. We're here today on the subject of state energy policy and greenhouse gas emissions. Good morning, Mr. Hardy.
Good morning.
Welcome back. Do we need to swear the witness in again?
Is he still under oath? I don't know, how long does that last?
That's a good. That was my question. How long does that last? I hope it lasts a lifetime. Okay. Mr. Hardy, did you bring any testimony up there with you today?
I did not.
Okay. We have your testimony that's already into the record. That is the direct testimony and your rebuttal testimony, as well as some supplemental testimony, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. We're going to focus today on the aspects of your testimony that deal with greenhouse gas emissions and the state energy policy. There are separate portions in your testimony that address those issues, correct?
That's correct.
At this time, do you have any changes, edits, or corrections that you would like to make to those portions of your testimony related to greenhouse gas emissions or to the state energy policy?
I do not.
At this time, the witness is available for questions from the board and from council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Verdi.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Verdi.
Good morning.
You know, I'm Jerry Elmer. I represent Conservation Law Foundation.
Yes.
You will agree with me that if this power plant would emit more carbon per megawatt hour than the average all electricity generators in New England is calculated by the ISO New England. Is that right?
Well, in answering that question, I guess I would say that, you know, our analysis shows that if this plant is built, the emissions in terms of tons of carbon per megawatt hour would displace higher emitting resources. So overall, the emissions for the system, which we've defined as New England and New York, would actually be lower. If you were to, in answering your question, if you were to look at just average rates for the entire system, it may be higher than the average. But that does not mean that emissions would rise, because you have to think about it in terms of what's being displaced.
Could I ask the stenographer to read back my question, please?
I mean, I'm not sure that I can answer that in a yes or no question.
Okay.
So that, I mean, I believe I've answered it as I understand it.
Chairperson, I'd like to give the witness a electronic calculator, a piece of discovery from the Inventergy, as well as the ISO New England Electric Generator Air Emissions Report.
I would just like to say that I think it is a yes or no question. I know you're about to go through a whole bunch of calculations, but do you want to think about that again? And
we could save a lot of time if Mr. Hardy gave a yes or no answer to a yes or no question. So, Mr. Hardy, let me make sure other counsel have these.
If I could just ask, the number that you said the average as calculated by ISO New England?
Let me get out the...
Sure.
I will. So I've given Mr. Hardy three things. One is Inventergy's responses to the town of Burrillville's 7th set of data requests. That's already in full. I've given him page 16 of 48. It's dated May 17th, 2016. I've given him a calculator, and I've given him the 2016 ISO New England Electric Generator Air Emissions Report, dated on the front page, January 2018. Now, Mr. Hardy, when I was away from the microphone, you were wanting to supplement your answer.
I was just going to ask, I assume in this report that the ISO has an average CO2 emissions for the system?
I'll ask the question. So we'll go through this carefully and slowly.
Okay.
On Inventergy's responses to Burrillville's data request, do you have that in front of you?
I do.
Inventergy says that when this plant is burning oil, it'll emit 1,227 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour of electricity produced. Is that correct?
I believe the respondent was Michael Feinblatt, but yes, that's what his response was.
Sorry, Michael.
Feinblatt?
Are you questioning the veracity or accuracy of Inventergy's response to Burrillville's data request?
No.
Okay. And you're aware of the fact that Inventergy's current permit application to DEM for a major source air permit says that Inventergy wants to be able to burn oil for up to 360 hours a year. Is that correct?
That sounds correct.
Will you accept that subject to check?
Sure.
And just to clarify, you are Inventergy's expert on air emissions.
No, I am not Inventergy's expert on air emissions.
Greenhouse gases.
And part of my testimony relates to the impact of Clear River on the system related to greenhouse gases. That's not the same as an air emissions expert, of which I am not.
Okay, but you are testifying as an expert on the matter of carbon emissions from this power plant.
As it relates to electricity market operations, yes.
And so you will accept, subject to check, that Inventergy's current amended air permit application with DEM says that the plant wants to be able to burn oil up to 360 hours a year.
Yes, subject to check, sure.
Okay. So that's, and you can use the calculator for this. I don't want you to accept any figures if you don't, if you're not fully satisfied that they're correct. 360 hours a year is 4.1% of the 8,760 hours in the operating year. Is that correct?
Yes.
So if we weight 4.1% of the hours times 1,227 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour, we come out with 50 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour for those hours that this plant would be burning oil. Is that right?
I'm not sure what we're trying to calculate. It would be helpful if I could get an explanation of what we're trying to calculate.
What we're trying to calculate here first is the pounds of carbon per megawatt hour that this plant will generate during the course of a year. Then we're going to look at the ISO New England Electric Generator Air Emissions Report And we're going to see what the average emissions are per megawatt hour of all generators on the ISO New England system. And we're going to deduct the second figure from the first figure. And we're going to get the difference in carbon produced per megawatt hour between this projected proposed power plant and the ISO New England average as reflected in the most recent air emissions report of the ISO.
Okay, that's helpful context. Just to be clear.
There's no question pending now.
Okay.
Do you want to check my arithmetic here? That we're looking at 50 pounds per megawatt hour of emissions from the 360 hours in a year that we're burning oil?
No, because I wouldn't calculate it this way. I've already provided my forecast of the operations for Clear River, and in those calculations, which I've provided data requests in detail, you can derive the pounds per megawatt hour of CO2 that are projected for Clear River. And I would not use these numbers to project that emissions. So I'm happy to do arithmetic, but I don't agree with the calculation.
You will agree that these are the numbers that Inventergy provided to this EFSB on May 17th, 2016, and are now in this case as a full exhibit.
They may be numbers that are in the case as an exhibit. This is an air permit. This is not the same as what the operations will reflect in terms of CO2 emissions in pounds per megawatt hour. You have to look at the projected operations of the plant. These are numbers of which will show maximum rates at different operating states. It's not the same as the plant operations.
Joanne, could you please read back the pending question for Mr. Hardy?
I believe he answered the question.
Is the question, are the numbers in this, are they a full exhibit?
The question is, were these numbers provided to the EFSB by Inventergy?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Okay. If you back out 360 hours a year of burning oil, this is a baseload plant. There are 8,760 hours in the operating year. You're left with 8,400 hours, which is 95.9% of the hours. Is that correct?
That sounds correct.
And will you accept, subject to check, that 95.9% times 781 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour is 749 pounds of carbon for the hours when this plant is burning gas?
I'll accept that your arithmetic is correct.
Thank you.
But I don't accept that that's reflective of the actual pounds per megawatt hour of CO2 that the plant will emit when it's operating.
50 pounds of carbon when burning oil, 749 pounds of carbon when burning gas, comes to a total of 799 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour of electricity produced from this plant using the figures that were provided to the EFSB by Inventergy on May 17th, 2016. Is that correct?
Those numbers sound correct based on the figures that were in the air permit. I would just say that I do not believe that that's the same as the projection of what the plant would emit in terms of pounds per megawatt hour of carbon.
So let's look at page 16 of Inventergy's responses to Burrill's 7th set of data requests. The data request that Inventergy was addressing says in relevant part, it is unclear how the CO2 emission rates were calculated for the combustion turbines. Please provide the calculation methodology. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And the answer that Inventergy gave was the average CO2 emission rate while firing natural gas will be 781 pounds per megawatt hour. Did I read that answer correctly?
Yes.
And then Inventergy went on and said the average CO2 emission rates for each fuel were calculated using CO2 pound per hour emission rates and output values as follows. And then when you jump down to ULSD, ultra low sulfur oil, we have 1,227 pounds per megawatt hour. Is that correct?
Yes, I see those numbers.
You see those numbers being represented to the EFSB as, quote, the average CO2 emission rate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the weighted average for this plant, according to this data response, is 799 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour of electricity. You get that by adding the 50 pounds when it's burning oil, 749 pounds when it's burning gas, and you come up with 799 pounds per megawatt hour of carbon emissions when this plant is producing electricity. Did I do that arithmetic correctly?
The arithmetic is correct, based on the numbers that are here.
Based on the numbers that Inventergy gave to the EFSB, is that correct?
Based on the numbers that are in the air permit, which is not the same as the emission rates when the plant is actually operating. It's apples and oranges.
Is this document the air permit?
I believe,
permit application?
I believe these numbers are reflective of what's in the air permit. It's not the air permit itself.
The question here is, it is unclear how the CO2 emission rates were calculated for the combustion turbines. And the answer is the average CO2 emission rates while firing. Is that right?
May I just say, I think the question's been asked and answered multiple times. He doesn't, Mr. Elmer may not like the answer, but he's asked it and it's been answered several times.
Are you familiar with the ISO's annual electric generator air emissions report?
Yes.
You're aware of the fact that this is published every year by the ISO New England?
Yes.
And it reflects air emissions.
That's correct.
And will you agree with me that the January 2018 publication is the most recent one that ISO has issued?
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Page 22. The chart at the top of the page. The bottom row, in the second column from the right, gives the average, weighted average, emissions rate for all generators in New England on the ISO New England system for carbon dioxide, and that number is 710 pounds per megawatt hour. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Page 20. Chart at the top of the page gives annual CO2 emissions rates calibrated in pounds per megawatt hour for all of New England. For carbon dioxide, that's the same number, 710 pounds per megawatt hour. Is that correct?
For New England, that's correct.
And that's the weighted average for all generators on the New England system, right?
That's correct.
That would be gas generators, nuclear, solar, wind, coal, oil, all of them.
Yes, all generations.
Okay. So let's go back to the Inventergy figure of 799 pounds per megawatt hour. And you may want to use the calculator for this. Using the figure 799 pounds per megawatt hour, how many pounds of carbon will this plant produce in the course of a year, assuming that it's a base load plant that'll be on all 8,760 hours, and that it'll be a 1,000 megawatt plant, although for the purpose of the calculation, since you have a calculator, if you want to use 997 megawatts, which was the ISO's determined seasonal claim capability for purposes of FCA 10, forward capacity auction 10, you can use the 997 megawatt figure.
To be honest, I prefer not to use a calculator. I was hired as the electricity market expert to project the emissions for this facility. I've done that and provided those materials. I don't believe the electricity system is a little bit more complicated, unfortunately, than can be calculated on a calculator. So I don't believe those numbers are representative of how the plant will operate. It's not going to run in every hour. It's not going to burn oil in the maximum amount of hours under the air permit. And I don't think it's reflective of the emissions. I've already calculated those numbers and put them into the record.
Joanne, could you please read back the pending question for the witness?
May I just point to post an objection? I think the question that he was asking has been, again, answered before. Not to mention the fact that the question is a very, very complicated question. It's very difficult to understand exactly what point he's trying to make there. The witness has said that he's not the air emissions expert. We have an air emissions expert who's coming in to testify, who's the respondent to the data response that Mr. Elmer is pointing to. I believe that believe that he's provided the information with regard to what he knows and what he's capable of testifying to, without having to draw this out into a long, involved, unnecessary calculation with a calculator.
Chairperson. Beginning on page 37 of Mr. Hardy's June 30, 2017 testimony, he goes on at length about carbon emissions from this plant, how to figure components of CO2 emissions, how carbon emissions are properly calculated, how they're improperly calculated. I understand that Mr. Hardy would prefer not to answer the question, but these are relevant questions that go to this power plant's application. Today is the day that we're looking at carbon emissions and climate impact. And as I told the board's attorney, Lucarelli, earlier today, and I'm happy to say here on the record, I have relatively few questions for Mr. Hardy. And as Director Coy pointed out correctly, a lot of them can be answered by yes or no. I would probably be done with my questions if Mr. Hardy were willing to give direct answers. CLF is not responsible for a witness who doesn't want to answer questions.
I would object to the characterization of the witness. If he has questions regarding to his testimony, I would suggest that counsel points the witness to the responses in his testimony and ask him a question with regard to his testimony.
I think he has referred to the areas on which his questioning is based. And you can cover this in your questioning of Richard. Mr. Hardy, is this on time? Okay. You accept, subject to check, that 799 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour of electricity. This plant will emit 6 billion, that's billion with a B, 999,240,000 pounds of carbon per year.
Subject to check on your math, and assuming that 799 was reflective of the plant's emission rate, which I would clarify, and I don't mean to be difficult, these are challenging questions to answer, yes or no. If that were the rate, subject to check on your math, I would agree with that. But I would say that the rate is likely much lower than that.
And you would agree that 799 pounds of carbon megawatt hour is more than what the ISO reports as the weighted average for all new generators of 710 pounds per megawatt hour.
Yes, the 799 would be higher than the average of 710 for New England. That's correct.
In fact, more than 12% higher, is that right?
Your math sounds correct, yes.
So this plant would emit 89 pounds more carbon per megawatt hour than the weighted average of all New England plants as reported by the ISO.
Again, and I think this is where we started, it's higher than the average in this case, using the 799. That number is higher than where I had the plant operating. And I think you need to look at it in terms of carbon displaced in the system, which is going to be a much higher number than the average.
Mr. Hardy, would you agree with me that New England has seen increased deployment of renewable energy resources over the past decade?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that sitting here today, you expect additional deployment of renewable energy resources in New England in the coming decade?
Yes.
In the coming 2 decades?
Yes.
You're aware of the fact that Rhode Island's carbon emission reduction goal, as set forth in the Resilient Rhode Island Act, is a reduction of 80% over 1990 levels by 2050. Is that correct?
That sounds correct, yes.
And you discussed the Resilient Rhode Island Act in some length in your testimony.
I do.
What is your expert opinion of the impact that this power plant would have if it were built in the year 2050 on the ability of Rhode Island to reduce its carbon emissions by 80% over 1990 levels?
Well, to be clear, my forecast did not go out to 2050. What I can tell you is based on the forecast that is contained in my analysis, the addition of Clear River to the electricity market will result in a reduction of carbon emissions. So I believe that this plant will help Rhode Island and really help New England achieve carbon reduction goals.
And to be clear, your analysis only went out 4 years, is that right?
That's correct. Although I would expect the carbon reduction to continue on past that. I just didn't run it out to 2050.
Right, and you said in your pre-filed testimony that you had done the analysis for 4 years, is that right?
That's correct.
And you said that although you didn't do the analysis, you would expect carbon emissions to run longer than those 4 years.
Reduction in carbon emissions,
right.
Yes.
Yes. My question now is, what is your expert opinion of the impact that this power plant would have if it were built in the year 2050 on the ability of Rhode Island to reduce its carbon emissions by 80% below 1990 levels?
I couldn't specifically comment on the year 2050 without running the analysis, but based on the impact that the plant will have during my study period, I would expect it to reduce carbon emissions for the system.
Nicole, I'm sorry, I don't know the number of the exhibit, but I'm looking at Mr. Hardy's pre-filed direct testimony of June 30th, 2017, and I would appreciate it if he could have that in front of him.
I think it's exhibit 36. In this stuff here.
Page 37. There's a boldface Roman numeral 5 in the middle of the page, and it says responses to testimony filed on behalf of the Conservation Law Foundation. You see that?
Yes.
Jerry, what page are you on? I'm sorry.
37.
I'm sorry, Alan. We're looking at page 37, and I was reading from lines 7 and 8.
Thank you.
And on line 10, you are asked, have you reviewed the testimony of CLF witness Professor Roberts? And you say yes. And then starting on line 13, you're asked about disagreements with Professor Roberts. And on line 15, you say, my two greatest concerns with Professor Roberts' pre-filed direct testimony is that he, one, fails to analyze CREC's emission impact on a regional basis, and two, that he incorrectly believes the Resilient Rhode Island Act should be implemented on a generation-based accounting methodology. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And generation-based accounting methodology was referred to in Dr. Roberts' testimony as production-based accounting, am I right?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And what you're saying here is that there's a difference in looking at the emissions that are properly attributed to the electricity sector if you do a production-based system of accounting, as Dr. Roberts did, or a consumption-based system of accounting, as both you and Dr. Kuhl did. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And you know, the reason being is, and I think Professor Roberts would agree, carbon emissions is a global issue. So it's important when you're looking at emissions, whether it's total emissions or the impact of different generators, to look at it on a system-wide basis to understand the impact. You can come to alternate conclusions if you're looking at, you know, just on a generation basis. So consumption basis looks at it on a system-wide basis to determine the impacts.
I'm very glad that you talked about system-wide basis and a global problem, because I do have a set of questions dealing with that, and we'll come to that in a moment. First, I'd like you to clarify, I appreciate your discussion about why one may be preferable to the other, but could you start by clarifying for the board, just as a descriptive matter, what is a consumption-based method of accounting for electricity, carbon emissions from the electricity sector, and what is a production-based method of accounting? I'll ask you in a moment about comparing and contrasting them, but for now, tell the board what the difference is.
Okay. So on a consumption basis, it really looks at, you know, from an electricity perspective, when we are using electricity, what are the emissions associated with that electricity use? So as a simple example, take the state of Rhode Island. Some of the electricity supply that serves the electricity demand comes from outside the state. So if you're to look just at the state of Rhode Island, you're not capturing the fact that there are imports coming from outside the state. And those imports have emissions. And it's hard to determine which plant it's actually coming from because the electricity system is inherently complicated. So the consumption base looks at, given the demand on the system, let's look at where all of the emissions are associated with serving that demand. That's consumption-based. Production or generation-based looks at a particular footprint and just says, this particular set of power plants or this particular supply, what are the emissions associated with that? So it basically just does a circle around a particular area of power plants and looks at the emissions associated with those plants. Typically, when looking at carbon emissions, because carbon is not a local pollutant, carbon is a global pollutant. So a ton of carbon emitted in Rhode Island versus Maine versus China has equal impact on the environment regardless of where that carbon is released into the environment. That's why you see a lot of carbon programs or carbon regulations really look at it as as wide a footprint as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, I'm not trying to trip you up, but I just want to be sure that we're talking about the same thing. You said that production-based accounting looks at a specific footprint and looks at the carbon emitted from electricity production within that footprint. Is that correct?
Yeah, and maybe footprint was maybe the wrong word, but the point is it looks at it just on the production basis, irrespective of where the demand is being served.
And it looks at production within a defined geographical area, like Rhode Island.
Sure.
And consumption-based accounting recognizes that we have a 6-state New England electricity grid, and that the electricity that we're using here in this building could come from anywhere. And so you look at the average emissions for the area, and then you discount for the amount that we are consuming within the geographical area. Is that fair?
I would say you look at the total emissions associated with the electricity that's needed to serve the demand or the consumption of that area.
Right. So in this case, Rhode Island is 6.11% of the load in the ISO New England footprint. Would you accept that subject to check?
Subject to check, sure. That sounds in the ballpark.
And so to look at carbon emissions by the consumption-based method, you would look at overall emissions for all of New England, multiply that by 6.11% to get the value for the emissions to be properly attributed to Rhode Island. Is that right?
I'm not sure that I would do it that way in terms of it being properly attributed to Rhode Island. I have to think that one through, but I guess if we're saying on a system-wide basis, if we have total emissions for the region, potentially I would have to think that one through. I'm not sure about that.
But in your testimony on page 37, lines 16 to 18, you are saying that Dr. Roberts is wrong to be using a production-based system of accounting because we have a regional New England electricity grid and they have to be viewed on a consumption basis to account for that New England-wide electricity grid. Is that fair?
That's correct. And maybe the simplest example is this. Under a generation-based accounting, if you wanted to look at the ability of Rhode Island to meet any carbon reduction, whether it's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative or the Resilient Rhode Island Act, under a generation-based accounting, Rhode Island could contract with a high carbon emitting coal plant located in the state of Connecticut. And by doing so, may run less of the natural gas, which also emits carbon but at a much lower rate, within the state. So under the generation-based accounting method, Rhode Island could say, we've now lowered carbon emissions. But actually they haven't, because they've contracted with a coal plant that's emitting now into the system a much higher amount of carbon. So at the end of the day, they could say, well, within the state of Rhode Island, we've lowered carbon emissions. But within the system, they've extremely increased the amount of carbon emissions. That's really the fundamental issue with generation-based accounting.
Although, when you're talking about generation-based accounting, even if you include contracting out of state for higher emission production, isn't that something that the state has control over?
Sure,
And
they have part of it, but
and if your effort is to try and influence whether it's states or individuals to change things that they have control over, doesn't that seem to mitigate it in favor of production-based?
No, I don't think so, because you'd still, what, my example is not necessarily to say what the policy should be. I'm simply talking about the way that it's measured. And so, if you do it under production-based.
Right, no, I'm just questioning whether, depending on what you measure, the choice of what you measure.
Well, there's the choice of policy, of the direction and strategy of your policy, but generation versus consumption doesn't really speak to the policy part of it. It's merely how you measure it. And so my point in my testimony is that in order to measure it correctly...
If you have two methodologies that can produce very different results depending on how you run the number, isn't that then a policy decision to choose one over the other?
Oh, yes, that's an excellent clarification. It is. In fact, you know, the states have gone through this exact discussion, and you can see that both Rhode Island and Massachusetts have chosen consumption-based accounting as it relates to carbon, measuring the impact of carbon emissions.
Well, hasn't the state chosen both methods in different situations? So under the Resilient Rhode Island Act, I believe it is consumption-based, but under some other calculations, don't they use the production-based?
I don't believe so.
What does Reggie use?
Reggie uses consumption-based.
If it helps, Chairperson,
I shouldn't get into any more of this.
I have a fairly lengthy set of questions on that exact subject. In the meantime, I would just ask Joanne to tab what Mr. Hardy said at 10:29 a.m. because we will come back to that. I want to go back to the hypothetical that you gave to the EFSB about production-based versus consumption-based, because I thought it was excellent. You used the hypothetical of a program that seeks to reduce carbon emissions in Rhode Island by building a coal-fired power plant just over the border in Connecticut, and then pretending that we were lowering emissions. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was more so to not that the program would build the plant itself, but more so just an example of how measuring could lead you to to a different conclusion under that methodology.
And isn't it a fact that the technical term of art that the ISO uses for that exact situation is leakage?
Yes, that's correct.
And in fact, the ISO letter to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection signed by Ann George of the ISO that you have as Exhibit 5 to your testimony here was on that very subject of leakage. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
Good. We'll come back to that letter. Just to be clear, you are advocating here consumption-based accounting, and Dr. Roberts is advocating production-based accounting. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware of the fact, Mr. Hardy, that the Rhode Island State Energy Plan, entitled Energy 2035, written by the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources and adopted by the Rhode Island Division of Planning as the official energy chapter of Rhode Island's State Guide Plan, consistently uses production-based accounting?
No, it's not.
Are you aware of the fact that Energy 2035, the state's guide plan for energy, consistently uses production-based accounting with regard to Rhode Island's electricity sector?
Objection. Do you have a reference, Mr. Elmer? If you have, we can pull it up.
Thank you.
Which page?
I'm sorry. I will represent to the EFSB that I've handed to the witness and up to the bench the first 41 pages, together with the full front material of introduction, table of contents, abstract, technical committee, acknowledgments, of a document entitled Energy 2035, Rhode Island State Energy Plan, State Guide Plan Element Report 120. I will represent to the EFSB that I contacted on Friday of last week the OER to get hard copies of the document. I was told by OER that hard copies don't exist, and I was sent to the website, and I printed these off of the website at the direction of OER staff.
And this is CLF, sorry, 16 for identification.
For identification. So let's look at page 2, and I'm looking at Arabic numeral 2 at the bottom of the page. There's a chart. Am I correct?
Sorry, I'm looking. Did you say numeral 2?
Arabic number 2, so it's not Roman numeral 2 for the front matter. We're looking at page 2 of the actual document.
Okay.
There's a chart at the bottom of the page. The headline is Overview of Energy in Rhode Island, and it shows Rhode Island's economy-wide energy consumption. And you notice that the electricity sector is the left part of that chart. And it shows that natural gas accounts for 97% of the emissions in Rhode Island from the electricity sector. Is that correct?
That's what this chart says.
And that has to be done on production-based accounting, because if you did consumption-based accounting, gas would only account for 48% of the emissions from Rhode Island from the electricity sector. Is that correct?
I'm not sure that you have to do it.
Objection. Objection. I don't believe that chart says anything about accounting. It talks about the makeup in a pie chart of the existing generation in Rhode Island.
I have one more document if I could have a moment.
It's nothing to do with the measurement of emissions in Rhode Island or elsewhere. It talks just about the physics of the type of energy production that exists here.
Mr. Hardy, do you recognize the ISO's New England power grid profile?
Yes.
And this explains what the sources of electricity production are in New England. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it gives for 2017 the relative shares of electricity that come from various fuel sources. Is that correct?
That's correct.
48% of the electricity in New England comes from natural gas. Is that right?
Yes.
31% comes from nuclear. Is that correct?
That's correct.
8% comes from large hydro. That's largely the Hydro-Quebec interconnection. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
11% comes from non-HQ renewables. Is that right?
That's correct.
2% from coal, 1% from oil.
Correct.
So if we were looking at emissions from the electricity sector in Rhode Island using your preferred consumption-based method, we would say that 48% of the electricity sector emissions came from natural gas. Is that right?
Objection. It says sources of production. This is of energy. It does not talk about the measurement of emissions. Same objection.
Hello.
Production.
Do you have the question in mind?
Well, production versus consumption-based accounting has to do with the measurement of CO2 emissions. This profile, the Rhode Island Energy Plan from 2015, these are not carbon emission regulations, nor are these about the measurement of carbon emissions.
Mr. Hardy, if you were looking at Rhode Island carbon emissions from the electricity sector using a consumption-based method of accounting, would you say 48% of the emissions came from gas?
No.
Okay. Would you say, if you were looking at consumption-based accounting, that 31% of the emissions came from nuclear?
No.
So looking at the chart on page 2 of the state guide plan, where it says that Rhode Island emissions from the electricity sector are 97% attributable to natural gas, you don't agree with me that this reflects a production-based system of accounting. Is that right?
I'm honestly not sure what it reflects.
Okay, let's look at page 9. There's the same chart, and your answer would be the same, that you do not agree that this reflects a production-based methodology of accounting for carbon emissions from the electricity sector. You don't accept that?
I'm not sure what it reflects.
The boldface text above the chart says, today Rhode Island's economy-wide energy consumption totals nearly 190,000 trillion BTUs. Does that help you understand that this is looking at page 13? So let's go back to page 2, Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Elmer, were you asking a question with regard to page 13?
No, I'm back to page 2. The chart is labeled at the bottom. In 2010, Rhode Island spent $3.6 billion on 190 trillion BTUs of energy, emitting 11 tons of CO2. 11 million tons of CO2. Do you see that?
I do.
Does that help you to understand that this chart is talking about carbon emissions?
Yes, it appears to be talking about carbon emissions from the electric, thermal, and transportation sectors.
And isn't it true that the only way you can get to 97% natural gas emissions in Rhode Island is if you look at a production-based method of accounting, because except for the Johnston landfill, all of the large generation assets in Rhode Island are gas-fired power plants.
Sorry, I'm not sure. What's the question?
Could you read back the pending question, please?
I'm not sure. I think I would need to see the data behind this graph. Potentially. I'm honestly not sure.
But you're aware of the fact that on a New England-wide basis, natural gas is only 48% of electricity production in the ISO New England footprint, right?
Yes, that's correct. As of 2017, I believe this report is as of 2015.
Does that, in your opinion, make a material difference?
Not to these percentages, no. But it's not. My only point is they're not referencing the same set of data, and I'm not really sure what they're trying to measure.
Mr. Hardy, I would like to ask a very simple question, I believe. Starting on page 5 of your direct, and you don't need it because you reference it over and over again. When you talk about approximately 1% reduction in regional emissions of CO2 over a period of years, is that regional calculation?
Yes, that's a regional calculation.
And is it production or consumption?
It's consumption-based.
Okay, thank you.
And just following up on Director Coyte's question, you will accept, subject to check, that Rhode Island is about 6.11% of the regional electricity load. Is that correct?
Subject to check, yes.
And so if this power plant, if your calculation were correct, that this power plant would reduce regional emissions by about 1%, you would attribute about 6.11% of that benefit to Rhode Island.
No, I wouldn't think about it that way. I think reduction in CO2 emissions are a benefit for everybody. I don't know that you contribute them to a particular state or even country.
Okay. Page 19, there's a chart. It's our same chart, except here the figure is that natural gas...
Sorry, are we in the state?
We're in the state,
2035?
yes, we're in the state guide plan.
Okay. You said 35?
Page 19.
Oh, 19. Sorry.
There's a similar chart, and it talks about emissions because it's labeled emitting 11 million tons of CO2. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it's very similar to the other charts, except here natural gas accounts for 98% of the emissions. Is that right?
I see that, yes.
And again, this would have to be on a production-based accounting system, because if you did a consumption-based accounting system, you would say 48%. Is that right?
I think I would give the same answer to
Okay.
this question before.
Isn't it a fact, Mr. Hardy, that when the ISO issues its annual electric generator air emissions report, it uses a production-based method of accounting for carbon emissions, as Dr. Roberts would recommend, and not a consumption-based method of accounting as you're advocating here today?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Let's look at page 11, figure 4-1.
This is in the air emissions report?
The ISO air emissions report.
Sorry, which page?
Page 11, figure 4-1. Let's look at Rhode Island.
Okay.
That shows for Rhode Island nearly 100% of our fuel mix being natural gas. Is that right?
Yes.
But if you were looking at a New England-wide fuel mix and then looking at Rhode Island on a consumption-based accounting method, is it not correct that this would be showing 48% for Rhode Island, not nearly 100%?
Not necessarily, no.
How could it be otherwise?
Well, I think maybe the confusion is when we talk about production versus consumption-based accounting, we're talking about the measurement of CO2 emissions. This figure is not talking about the measurement of CO2 emissions. It's just showing where capacity is located in each state.
This is an air emissions report.
That's correct.
Do you disagree that the chart, figure 4-1 on page 11, must necessarily be looking at a production-based accounting method?
I don't believe that figure 4-1 is looking at any accounting method. I think it's just showing the type of capacity that is in each state.
As the Rhode Island State Energy Plan was.
That's correct.
And there are different methods of looking at how to calculate emissions from a particular state.
Yes, we've established there are different
Okay.
methods. Figure 4-1 is not showing, I don't think, any particular method.
I may have a moment, Chairperson.
Okay, we're going to use this as an opportunity to take a quick break, 10 minutes.